Welcome, friends. The storm outside is fierce tonight, the thunder cracking like a warning. But here, within these words, I have a story, a gift for you, a gift that will guide you through the dark, calm your mind, and help you drift off to sleep. Despite the storm's roar, just remember, the rain might be scary, but you're safe here. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell, so you never miss the next tale. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Dr. Michael Rivers had been a highly respected surgeon at St. Thomas Hospital for over a decade. He was known for his precision, his steady hands, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. There was no surgery too difficult, no procedure too complicated. He had earned his reputation through years of hard work and countless successful surgeries. But there was one thing that even Dr. Rivers couldn't explain. The curse. It started as a whisper among the staff, a rumor that seemed to circulate in hushed tones, exchanged between nurses, technicians, and even the doctors who worked alongside him. They spoke of the surgical suite, an operating room that had been in use for decades, but no one could remember when it was last renovated. The rumors spoke of unexplainable deaths, strange occurrences, and failed procedures that defied medical logic. At first, Dr. Rivers brushed it off. He had been through enough surgeries to know that accidents happen, especially in a place like St. Thomas, where the most critical and complicated cases were sent. But the more he heard about the cursed operating room, the more uneasy he became. It wasn't just the rumors, it was the feeling, the sensation that something was wrong. A sense that hung over the room like an invisible presence, watching, waiting. He didn't want to believe it. After all, he was a man of science. But when he was assigned to perform an emergency surgery in that very room, his skepticism would soon be put to the test. The patient, a middle-aged man, John Matthews, had been admitted with severe trauma after a car accident. His vitals were unstable, his injuries severe. Rivers had dealt with worse. He was confident that he could save the man. The moment he entered the surgical suite, however, something felt different. It wasn't just the sterile, cold environment. It was the room itself. The air felt thick, the atmosphere suffocating, like it was pulling at him, trying to drag him down. He could feel the weight of the room's history pressing in on him. As the surgery began, things started to spiral out of control. Every step of the procedure that should have gone smoothly turned into a nightmare. The monitors malfunctioned, the equipment jammed, and Rivers' hands began to tremble. The atmosphere grew darker, and just as he thought things couldn't get worse, he heard it, a voice. A soft whisper that echoed through the sterile silence. "You shouldn't have come." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He was sure he'd heard something. He glanced around the room. The only other people were the nurses, their faces tense with concern, but they hadn't heard anything. It was then that he realized this wasn't just a bad surgery. Something in this room was actively trying to stop him, but it was already too late. The whispers were getting louder, and what happened next would change his life forever. Dr. Michael Rivers felt the cold sweat trickle down his back as he glanced at the monitors again. John Matthews' vitals were unstable, erratic even, and no matter how many times he adjusted the settings or recalibrated the equipment, nothing seemed to work. It was as though the room itself was rejecting his efforts. The air was thick. The whispers, too faint to be clear at first, had now become impossible to ignore. They were soft, like the rustling of paper, but distinct in their urgency. "You shouldn't be here, doctor." It was louder this time, so much louder that the nurse beside him turned, clearly startled. "Dr. Rivers," she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" He glanced at her, momentarily confused. He hadn't said anything aloud, but then the whisper came again, so close it felt like a breath against his ear. "You're meddling with things you don't understand." Dr. Rivers' stomach turned. He quickly tried to push the thought out of his mind. He was a surgeon. He'd been in countless life or death situations. He wasn't going to be scared by some voices that logically could only be the stress of the surgery catching up with him. But then things started to get worse. The room seemed to darken. A cold breeze swept through the operating suite. Despite the lack of any open windows, the sterile lights above flickered violently, casting long shadows across the room. The instruments on the tray started to rattle. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in. And still, the whispers persisted, growing in intensity. "It was never supposed to be you." The voice was clearer now, almost mocking. "But now you'll understand." Rivers shook his head, trying to focus on Matthews. The patient's heart rate had dropped dangerously low. He couldn't afford distractions now. He called out to the nurse, "Prepare for a transfusion. Stat. We need to stabilize him." But as he turned to face the surgical team, everything seemed to warp. The nurse's face contorted, no longer the familiar face he'd seen every day at the hospital. Instead, her features twisted and shifted into something almost unnatural, as though her very form was being pulled apart by invisible hands. Rivers blinked. The vision was gone. The nurse was back to normal, but his heart was racing. The stress was getting to him. It had to be. There was no way that this was happening. The room was closing in on him. He couldn't breathe. He needed to focus. He forced himself to steady his hands. But as he pressed the scalpel to the patient's chest, something stopped him. The air was thick, heavy, like something was physically holding him back. He couldn't move his arm. "You can't fix him," the voice whispered, louder now, as if the walls of the room had swallowed it whole. "This surgery will be your last." Rivers gasped and jerked his arm back. But as soon as he did, the temperature dropped even further. He could see his breath condense in the air. The monitors began to beep erratically, all at once. The blood pressure, the heart rate, everything was spiraling out of control. Rivers looked down at Matthews, whose face was now deathly pale, the steady rhythm of life that had been there earlier, gone. He's dead," one of the nurses said in disbelief, stepping back from the table. David blinked. No, he couldn't accept that. Not yet. There had to be something he could do. He had to save him. "We need to get him back. Restart his heart. Now," Rivers ordered, but the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. The nurses were frantic, running to prepare the defibrillator. But as they approached, they froze in their tracks, their eyes locked on the same spot. David turned, his eyes widening. In the corner of the room, just beyond the shadows, stood a figure, the silhouette of a man, tall, thin, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to draw the very light from the room. He was standing perfectly still, his face a mask of cold indifference. The whispers intensified. The figure didn't move, but it was staring at David, as though it was waiting for something. "Who are you?" Rivers managed to breathe, his voice barely a whisper. His heart was racing, pounding against his chest, as though it might explode. The figure didn't answer, but as the air seemed to get colder still, the whispers stopped, replaced by one single, unmistakable voice. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Dr. Rivers. You're next." The lights flickered violently, and in that instant, Matthew's body jerked. His heart monitor beeped, flatlined. Rivers stared at the body, numb. It couldn't be happening. Not now, not like this. Matthews wasn't supposed to die. He had been in perfect condition until his gaze flickered back to the figure. But the figure was gone. His mind reeled. What had just happened? What was that thing? And where had it gone? Rivers felt the bile rise in his throat. He turned away from Matthews, the man now, a lifeless corpse on the operating table, his death caused by something unseen. Then the voice returned. "You've become part of it, Dr. Rivers. The hospital's blood runs through your hands now, just like the others." David backed away, his body trembling, his eyes wild. The hospital had claimed him, just like it had claimed Matthews, and now there was no going back. The world seemed to tilt for Dr. Michael Rivers. The operating room, once a place where he felt in control, now felt like a twisted nightmare. The body of John Matthews lay still on the table, the lifeless form a stark reminder of what had just occurred. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't quiet. The figure, the voice, the whispers, they were all so real. But how could this be? How could this happen in a place he had trusted so completely? The room was eerily quiet now. The soft beep of the heart monitor, which had once been a steady rhythm, was now a constant, deafening flatline. The nurses stood still, faces pale, unsure of what to do. Dr. Rivers could feel their eyes on him, but he couldn't focus on them. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his vision, was overwhelming. "We need to call the time of death," one of the nurses said, her voice distant, almost mechanical. Rivers didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Matthew's body. There was something in him, some primal instinct, that was telling him this wasn't the end. Not yet. He could feel it deep in his gut. Matthews wasn't supposed to die like this. He shouldn't have. "Dr. Rivers," another nurse asked, but Rivers didn't hear her. The whispers had returned, this time louder, more forceful, their urgency more apparent. "It's not over. He's part of the cycle now, just like the others." Rivers spun around, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was there again, standing just behind him. It was the same one, the same shadowy presence that had been there before, just beyond his vision, waiting for him to notice. His pulse quickened. The air was colder now, colder than it should have been for a surgical room that was meticulously maintained. The lights flickered again, dimming in rhythm with the growing intensity of the whispers. "You're not getting out of here," the figure said. Its voice was deep, distorted. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound entirely like a ghost either. Rivers' heart was racing. He took a step backward, but his legs felt weak. His body wasn't obeying him. He couldn't run, couldn't escape. He reached out for the edge of the operating table to steady himself, but his fingers passed through it, as though it were made of mist. He gasped, pulling his hand away. His mind spun, trying to process the impossibility of what had just happened. "You opened the door," the figure whispered again, its voice like a broken echo. "Now you're part of it. You've crossed the threshold. There's no turning back now." Rivers' head swam with panic. He couldn't think straight. The lights above flickered once more, and then nothing. The room plunged into darkness. The coldness intensified. It was like ice was in the very air, seeping into his skin, freezing him in place. The floor beneath him was shifting now, the walls moving, bending. The operating room was no longer solid. It was as though it had transformed into something else, something alive. The sound of something heavy, like the beating of a heart, echoed through the room, growing louder, faster. Then, in the pitch-black void, Rivers saw them, the shadows, the figures. They were standing around him now. There were dozens of them, patients, doctors, nurses, some of them familiar, others unrecognizable, all of them staring at him with hollow eyes, their mouths open, as if in a silent scream. "They're waiting for you," one of the figures said. It was a man, his face pale and ghostly, his body marked with surgical scars. "The hospital never lets you go. Not once you've been chosen." Rivers stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. I just need to wake up. This can't be happening." But the figures didn't disappear. They were closing in on him. Their bodies were unnervingly still, their eyes empty and void of life. Yet they were moving closer, pulling him deeper into the room. "You've been chosen, Dr. Rivers. You can't leave this place." Rivers fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached for his head, trying to block out the whispers, the cold presence of the dead surrounding him. He could feel them, hear them. Their fingers brushed against him, like the cold touch of death itself. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" Rivers gasped, his voice hoarse. The figures were silent now, but their eyes bored into him. And then the figure, the shadow that had first appeared, stepped forward. It was no longer just a figure, it had formed now. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow, wearing the same surgical mask Rivers had seen before. "This is the heart of the hospital," the man said. His voice was deep and resonant, a low hum that seemed to echo in Rivers' very bones. "The cycle doesn't stop, Dr. Rivers. Not for you, not for anyone." Rivers could feel it, the power, the presence of the hospital itself, pulsing through the room, feeding on the souls it had trapped. He was part of it now. The whispers, the shadows, they were all part of the same cycle, and he was trapped in it. "It's not your fault," the figure said. "You've been a part of this place for far longer than you realize, and now we are part of you." Rivers' heart clenched in his chest as the shadows closed in. The pulse of the hospital, the rhythm of the dead, filled the room. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the deep, suffocating darkness. And just like that, Dr. Rivers understood. He had opened the door. He had crossed the threshold. Now there was no going back. Dr. Michael Rivers' heart pounded in his chest as the darkness continued to close in on him. The room, the hospital itself, had become a living, breathing entity, and he was trapped inside it. The figures surrounding him, the whispers, the unnatural presence, they were all a part of it. The cursed cycle had ensnared him, and now there was no escape. As the shadows closed in, he could hear their voices, not just in his ears but inside his head. Their words, fragmented, urgent, endless, sounded like a haunting chant. "You will never leave. We are part of the hospital now. The dead feed the cycle. You feed the cycle." David's hands trembled as he pressed them against his temples, trying to block out the cacophony of voices. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The walls were pressing in on him, suffocating him. His body felt heavy, like he was being pulled into the very ground beneath him. Suddenly, a blinding light pierced the darkness, blurring his vision. He flinched, shielding his eyes as the light grew brighter. When it finally dimmed, he found himself standing in a different place, one he recognized, the sterile, cold, operating room. But it wasn't the same room he had been in before. There was no equipment, no surgical instruments, just darkness, thick and oppressive, that surrounded him like a suffocating blanket. And then he saw them. The figures, the dead, the people he had once treated, once healed, their lifeless eyes staring at him as they hovered just beyond the edges of his vision. They weren't fully present, they flickered, like ghosts caught between worlds, but their presence was undeniable. They were here, in the operating room. They were waiting. "You've come back," one of them whispered. It was a woman, her face pale, her body limp as she floated toward him. Her eyes were empty, vacant. "You were always meant to come back." "No," Rivers whispered, his voice shaking. "No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." The woman didn't respond. She simply extended her hand toward him, a faint smile crossing her features. The moment she touched him, he felt a coldness seep into his body, as if her touch were freezing him from the inside out. His chest tightened, and the air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. "The cycle is complete," the woman murmured, her voice like a distant echo. "You will never leave. You are part of the hospital now, just like the others." David stumbled back, the weight of her words crashing over him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You will join us. You will never leave." He turned, looking for a way out, but there was none. The room was endless now. No walls, no doors, just the same dark emptiness, filled with the eyes of the dead, all staring at him, all waiting for him to join them. "We never leave," the woman repeated, her voice chilling. "And neither will you." Suddenly the room shifted again. The operating table appeared before him, but there was no patient on it. Instead, it was his own body, lying lifeless on the table, pale and cold, just like the countless others he had treated over the years. His heart stopped. His breath stopped. David couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight of his own body. The figure of the dead woman stepped closer, her hand brushing against his cold skin. "This is the price," she whispered. "This is the cost of the cycle. You take lives, and you lose your own." David fell to his knees, his heart shattering as the truth settled in. The hospital had claimed him. He was part of it now. He had become like the others, the ones he had once helped, the ones who had disappeared without a trace, the ones who had died in this very place. The whispers stopped. Silence descended over him. But it wasn't peaceful. It wasn't a calm silence. It was a suffocating, oppressive quiet that filled every inch of the room, every part of his mind. He couldn't escape. He couldn't breathe. "You are ours now," the voice of Dr. Harlow said, cutting through the stillness. His voice was familiar, but it was wrong, twisted, as though it had been warped by time. "You can never leave." David's vision blurred as the room spun around him. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his breath came in short, panicked bursts. The hospital had claimed him. There was no going back, no escaping the cycle. And then the whispers returned. But they were different this time. They weren't just speaking to him. They were speaking through him. "We are the cycle. We are the heart of the hospital. We are the dead who never leave." David gasped for air, his body shaking, as he realized the truth. He wasn't just trapped in the hospital's cycle. He was the cycle. He was part of the hospital's heartbeat, the blood that kept it alive, the essence that sustained it. And just like the others, he would never leave. Dr. Michael Rivers could feel it now. The pulse of the hospital. It wasn't a steady rhythm like a heartbeat should be. No, it was erratic, like the desperate, gasping breaths of something alive, something unnatural. His vision flickered, and in an instant he was no longer standing in the operating room. He was in the hospital. It was all around him now. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to pulse in time with the cursed rhythm. He was part of it. He could feel it seeping into his skin, filling his veins. The hospital's pulse was his now. The cold was unbearable. His hands trembled as he reached out, trying to steady himself. But the room kept shifting. It wasn't just the hospital. It was his mind. Everything felt wrong, as if reality itself was warping around him. There were faces in the walls, eyes staring at him from every crack, every corner, waiting. "Welcome home, Dr. Rivers." A voice echoed through the darkness. It wasn't just one voice. It was many dozens, hundreds, all speaking in unison, overlapping, blending into one. "You've always been here. You've always been part of us." David tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness, the thick, suffocating presence of the hospital. "Where am I?" His own voice sounded foreign, distant, as though it wasn't even his. "You're in the heart of the hospital," the voice answered, its tone sharp and cold. "The place where it all begins and ends." He tried to take a step, but his feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, like the hospital itself was pulling him under. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, like a living thing, and for a split second he saw them, patients, doctors, nurses, all staring at him, their eyes hollow, their bodies still, like they were trapped in some twisted nightmare. "This is where the cycle continues," another voice whispered. "You are bound to it now." David's heart raced in his chest, and his breath came in short, frantic gasps. He tried to break free, to run, but his legs were too weak. Every step felt heavier than the last. The hospital had consumed him, body and soul. It was too late. He had opened the door, and now he was trapped inside the cycle, just like all the others before him. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, closing in. He could feel them pressing against his skin, seeping into his thoughts. "We never leave," the voices said. "We are the dead, the forgotten, and we feed the hospital. We are the ones who keep it alive." Suddenly, the floor beneath him cracked open, and David fell. He fell into the darkness, into the heart of the hospital, where the pulse was the loudest, where the whispers were deafening. He landed hard, but there was no pain. There was nothing but the rhythmic, oppressive heartbeat. And then he saw it, the heart of the hospital. It wasn't a beating organ. It was a mass, a pulsating mass of flesh, cables, and twisted metal, wrapped in an eerie, glowing light. The hospital's very core, the place where the cycle began and ended, the place where life and death blurred into one. David's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a physical blow. This was it. This was where the souls of the dead were bound. This was where they fed, and now he was part of it. He was bound to the heart, to the cycle. There was no escape. "You are ours now, Dr. Rivers," the voice of Dr. Harlow echoed in his mind. "Just like the others, you will never leave." David reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the mass at the center of the room. It was cold, like ice, but alive. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy rushed through him, coursing through his veins, filling him with a strange, unnatural power. He could feel it now. The hospital's pulse was his pulse. The lives it had consumed were his. The dead were all around him, trapped in the cycle, feeding the hospital's heart. And he was part of it. "You're one of us," the voices whispered again. "You will never leave." David's eyes filled with tears. but the emotion felt distant, foreign. The weight of the hospital's presence crushed him. It wasn't just the building, it was alive. It had always been alive. And now, it had claimed him. The heartbeat grew louder, the whispers growing more frantic. David's vision blurred as the world around him began to shift again. He could feel his body fading, his mind dissolving into the pulse of the hospital. There was no escape. There was no going back. He was bound to the heart of the hospital, just like the others. And now, he would never leave. The darkness that surrounded Dr. Rivers was no longer oppressive. It was inviting. It welcomed him like an old friend, a presence that had been with him all along. The hospital's pulse, that steady rhythmic thrum, filled his chest, his head, his very soul. He couldn't escape it. There was no use in fighting. But as the pulse grew louder, as the whispers became more frantic, David could feel something else stirring within him. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something worse. A hollow emptiness, a gnawing hunger that stretched deep within him, clawing at his insides. His vision flickered, and he was back in the operating room, the one that had started it all. The lights above him hummed in sync with the hospital's heartbeat, casting eerie shadows across the sterile walls. The body of John Matthews still lay on the table, the same patient he had failed to save. But Matthews wasn't dead anymore. His chest rose and fell with an unnatural rhythm. Rivers tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And then Matthews' eyes snapped open. David froze. The man's gaze was empty, void of life. But there was something else behind those eyes. A presence, a hunger. "You failed," Matthews whispered, his voice low and strained. "But you're still part of us now, part of the cycle." David's pulse quickened, his hands clenched into fists, but his body refused to obey him. He couldn't escape. Matthews' body jerked suddenly, his arms twitching like a marionette. Rivers stepped back, but the shadows of the room stretched out, wrapping around him, pulling him closer. "No, this can't be real," David gasped, his voice trembling. But Matthew's body rose from the table, his limbs stiff and unnaturally straight. He didn't move like a living person anymore. He moved like a puppet, his eyes still locked on David. "It's real, doctor. It's all real. The hospital never lets us leave. Not fully. We just..." Matthew's words faltered, his form flickering like a broken signal, his body warping into something else, something more sinister. His mouth opened wider, the darkness in his eyes growing. It was as if the hospital itself was speaking through him. "We feed the hospital. We are the hospital. And now you will feed too." David couldn't breathe. He staggered back, his eyes wide with terror. The walls of the operating room seemed to stretch infinitely, the shadows writhing, the lights flickering violently. The heartbeat, that terrible maddening pulse, was louder now. Its rhythm was chaotic, like it was trying to tear the very room apart. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Dr. Harlow appeared. But this time, he wasn't just a figure standing at the edge of the room. He was in the center, standing tall, his face a grotesque mask of madness. His eyes were wide, unnaturally bright, like something was wrong inside them. His lips curled into a twisted smile. "You've become one of us," Harlow's voice rasped. "You've opened the door. Now you're part of it. You're part of the hospital." David felt a chill run through his spine. The truth was undeniable now. The curse that had plagued this hospital had consumed him. He was no longer just a man. He was part of it. The dead didn't leave. They lingered, and so did he. "You can never escape," Harlow whispered, his voice blending with the whispers of the dead. "You are bound here now, just like me, just like them." David's heart was pounding in his chest as he backed away. There was no escape, no exit. The hospital had claimed him, and now it would keep him. The pulse, the heartbeat, it was all part of the cycle, and he was part of it now. The air grew thick, suffocating. He could feel the presence of the hospital around him, in him, through him. And then, just when he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, the room fell silent. For a brief moment, everything went still. But then the whispers returned. "We are the hospital. We are the dead that never leave." The ground beneath David's feet began to shift again, the walls closing in. He could feel his mind fracturing. The hunger in his chest grew, a void that could never be filled. The walls of the operating room cracked open, revealing an endless abyss. David screamed, but his voice was lost in the darkness, swallowed by the pulse. There was no way out, no way to escape. And then, in that final moment, the world collapsed around him. The darkness swallowed him whole, and Dr. Michael Rivers, once a man of science, was now a part of the hospital, an eternal prisoner in the cycle of the dead.